Hey everyone, and welcome back to YFNA. I know it's been a while since we've been here. I'm your host for tonight's debate, Ethan Michael, and alongside me are Dean Meadows and Richard Gilliver. How you guys doing?
I'm doing great.
Yeah, I'm doing very, very good. I'm very excited for this.
You're good. You're both pumped up and ready to go. Taking the gloves off.
Jacked.
So what we will be doing is each individual will be giving an opening statement, and then it'll go into free-form dialogue. Feel free to ask questions in the comments via super chat, and the debate topic for tonight is: are miracles evidence of God's existence? Taking the affirmative today is going to be Dean Meadows, I actually don't know what position you're holding to on this, but I'll just say the opposition. Richard Gilliver. Okay, you guys ready?
Yeah.
All right. What we agreed on beforehand is Dean is going to start with his opening statement. Dean, go ahead.
All right. Well, first, I want to thank Ethan for asking us to be on the show. Secondly, I'd like to thank Richard for taking the time to have this dialogue. So tonight's debate centers around the question, are miracles evidence for the existence of God? Now, before I make my case, I just want to define a couple of terms. By miracle, I mean that is an event that would not have happened if the natural world were left to itself. And so by natural world, I simply mean a world that includes creatures and beings such as we are and other related beings, but nothing radically different than what we encounter now. By evidence, I mean any consideration that, if true, raises the probability of a hypothesis. And by God, I'm simply appealing to classical theism here, general definition used in classical theism of being that possesses a particular set of attributes with regards to power, knowledge, and moral character. And so, given these definitions, my goal tonight is merely to affirm basic logic regarding the question, are miracles evidence for the existence of God? So the audience should note that the question itself presupposes the existence of miracles, just like the question, are eyes evidence for the existence of vision? The question presupposes that eyes are present. So it isn't necessarily a matter of do eyes exist, but rather, given that they do exist, do they raise the probability of vision? And so in the same manner, the question for the discussion tonight presupposes the existence of miracles and asks the question, given that miracles exist, do they raise the probability of God's existence? And I think the clear answer to that question is yes. Now, before I elaborate, notice what the question does not require. It does not require examples or a defense of miracle claims from any religious text, even though there are, nor does it require the example and defense of a modern day miracle claim, though there are many. And now, while these are noteworthy and I would even say juicy topics of discussion, it's not the question that's on the table tonight. If a miracle is an event that would not have happened if the natural world were left to itself, then we could suppose that in order to get the explanation right, there would have to be an appeal to something non-natural, something outside the order of nature. And so if this is the case, then it is a consideration that raises, it is evidence, a consideration that raises the probability of the hypothesis that God exists. So given that the topic of tonight's discussion already presupposes the existence of miracles, Richard can't merely just show that miracle claims in religious texts have been debunked or that the texts themselves are historically unreliable, nor can he simply provide counter evidence to modern day miracle claims, because these are outside of the scope of the discussion tonight. And should he do such, he's simply missing the target of the discussion. Now, the audience should keep in mind that what Richard has to show tonight is that if miracles, these things, events that would not have occurred if nature were left to itself, already exist, their existence is not evidence. Their existence is not that which, if true, raises the probability of the hypothesis. It's not evidence of God's existence. So this really, in my mind, and these are the only couple of things that I could think of. I might think of more along the way. This leaves Richard with one of two options that I can think of. First, he either has to use a non-standard definition of miracle to avoid the implications of the debate question, or Richard has to show how a non-natural event can take place but not raise the probability of the existence of God. Either way, if he redefines miracle, he's simply making just a bad philosophical move to avoid the implications of the discussion question. And then secondly, I just don't think that any atheist can show how a non-natural event doesn't raise the probability of God's existence. So given all of these things combined together, I think that it's clear based upon the question that miracles are evidence for the existence of God.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Dean. Do you want to forego the rest of your time? Okay, cool. Richard, on to you.
Yeah, that was a very interesting introduction. I'll respond to some of the. I want to get my introduction out of the way first, but I think in doing so, I might respond to a couple of the problems that I've got with a couple of the things that Dean said anyway. But I'll go into it and then we'll see what happens. I agree that before we go into it, we should define and investigate what we mean by miracles. So there are two definitions of a miracle, according to Merriam-Webster. There is the event manifesting divine intervention in human affairs. And the second definition is an extremely outstanding or usual event, thing, or accomplishment. I think we both probably agree that our conversation today will be centered around the first definition, but I think it's vital that we bear the second one in mind, because when talking about biblical miracles, there is a significant confusion between the two. I'll touch on that in a bit more detail in a bit. So let's begin by looking more closely at definition number one. For this, and I know Dean's not a Catholic, but I've used the Catholic definition of miracle just simply because it seems to be the most encompassing one of kind of general Christian claims around miracles. So if you've got any problems with any specifics of this, Dean, I'll gladly take them on board. So the Catholic Church defines a miracle as a sign or wonder such as a healing or control of nature, which can only be attributed to divine power. I find this a bit problematic for a couple of reasons, and we can split miracle claims in the Bible into different categories. Those which are replicable by other means, such as Jesus walking on the water or changing water into wine, healing the sick, and talking donkeys. Those which are exceptionally unlikely, such as Abraham and Sarah conceiving Isaac in old age, and those which appear to contradict the laws of nature or the laws of logic, such as people coming back from the dead. I don't think any of these categories are sufficient to say that they are only attributable to divine power. A, by its very nature, can be replicated by other means. B falls into the category of the law of very large numbers and statistically unlikely events. And C would have to be actual events and not attributable to cognitive or psychological errors or changes in brain state caused by intoxication or injury, and shown to be more likely or even possible against other candidate explanations. So let's go back to the Catholic Church's definition of miracle. This seems to contradict the Catholic Church's own view on the canonization process, which states that a miracle is almost always in reference to the spontaneous and lasting remission of a serious, life-threatening medical condition. The healing must have taken place in ways that the best informed scientific knowledge cannot account for and follow prayers to the holy person. This is problematic because not only do A and B not qualify for this, but C isn't sufficiently demonstrable to account for a God. Furthermore, we have a difficulty of cognitive bias built into this definition. Healing after prayers isn't demonstrative that the prayers cause the healing. Healing inexplicable by scientific knowledge doesn't by default demonstrate that a God is responsible. Statistically unlikely or impossible events are often called miracles. The mathematician J.E. Littlewood suggested that these happen statistically at a rate of 1 in a million and at a frequency of about 1 per month per individual. This is a subset of the law of very large numbers. I personally think that the only miracle claims that falls into C is the resurrection account. And I think if we're going to make any assessment at all on whether supernatural claims are sufficient to demonstrate God's existence, this is the best place to go. Indeed, this seems to be the only biblical miracle claim that seems to be truly supernatural in scope. That a man died, that is, was medically brain dead and then returned to life. Indeed, this seems to be an opinion shared by Dean himself, where on the line, the internet show, Dean called in and said to host Jimmy Snow and Vila Bianca, the central piece of Christianity is the resurrection. And 1 Corinthians 15 pointed out that if the resurrection is not true, Christianity is false. That being said, if Dean wants to spend a little time on the other miracle claims in the Bible, I'm more than happy to do so, although by his opening, he doesn't seem to want to actually do that at all. The illusion of people walking on water has been carried numerous times by magicians and illusionists. You know, these things have been clearly seen. I'm sure that both me and Dean both agree that we should be doing more than just assessing the Bible by saying, you're a Christian and I'm not, therefore we disagree. Of course, in assessing the resurrection account, we do have to look at what is written in the Bible, and we do have to assess it. Of course, Dean has spoken on this before as well, on a call to the perspective hosted by my good friend Kenneth Leonard and Arden Hart. Yes, I've done my own work. He said, I would say that because the sources are in the Bible, you can't use them to talk about the Bible. But if that's the case, we couldn't talk about Roman sources to talk about Rome. But I think that's bordering on a little bit of dishonesty. That what we do have to do is look at the differences in analysis between the claims. For example, Cleopatra predated Jesus by around 30 years and had coins, reliefs, and statues. And very importantly, we also know who those artworks represented, the way they were to invoke stylistic ideals. Contemporary accounts, for example, Augustus. We know about her family line, the Ptolemies. We have both pro and anti accounts of her both in and close to her lifetime. In short, a plethora of independent, verifiable evidence from both pro and anti sources, from both contemporary and later sources. We simply do not have anywhere near as much information as that for the resurrection account. In fact, we have none of the physical evidence. We have no contemporary extra-biblical accounts. By the strictest definition, we have no contemporary accounts at all of the resurrection. So for me, Dean's claim to Arden and Kenneth is simply not true. And yet we do need to assess that claim. And as the Bible is the only direct source of that claim we have, then we must use the Bible to talk about the Bible. But we must do so cautiously, aware that our very starting place is no contemporary supporting evidence. And that's a difficulty. In fact, we'll call that our first difficulty. Our second difficulty is what is commonly referred to as the courtroom or eyewitness argument. Now, we all know this has been done to death, but I really do think that it deserves a closer look. The arguments for are usually that there are multiple eyewitnesses, and we should expect slight discrepancies. The arguments against are usually that eyewitness testimony simply isn't sufficient evidence. But I hope to really pull this apart later in the conversation, as well as asking, were they even eyewitnesses at all? Our third, and for me the most problematic element, and one I admit that I've not really heard discussed before, is whether given an independence yardstick, even if we take the Christian interpretation to be reasonable case to accept the argument, does the Christian case stand up as a truly unique event? I don't think so. And if I may repeat Dean's own quote from when he called the line, the central piece of Christianity is the resurrection. And 1 Corinthians 15 points out that the resurrection is not, if it's not true, then Christianity is false. I think that this is hugely, hugely problematic. Even if the resurrection is true, and thus Christianity is true.
1 minute left, Richard.
If it is not unique, then what point is there in being true? Again, I hope to point this out in some depth later. So my agenda is fourfold during this debate. It's to properly answer the question, are miracles evidence of God's existence? We should ask, how are we defining miracles? How should we assess the historical evidence? Are eyewitnesses sufficient to evidence the resurrection claim? And do we have an independent yardstick by which to measure the resurrection as a truth claim? And I'm done.
Thank you, Richard. So now we're going to lead into free-form dialogue. So, Dean, if you want to start with replying, and then you two can just go back and forth and have an open discussion.
Well, I want to commend Richard. I think out of all of the times that I've ever done an online debate or discussion, I've never had somebody quote me as much as Richard has in his opening. And, I think that, what Richard has said is interesting. But if you look at the framework of the debate is not, as I mentioned, the framework is not, are all the religious texts and their claims of miracles true or not? It's not even the question of, do we have, or is eyewitness testimony good to go with regards to the resurrection? Do we have an independent yardstick? The question at hand for tonight's debate is, are miracles evidence for the existence of God? And so my first question, I guess, to Richard would be, setting aside all the extracurricular, activities that went on in his opening, like, even if he doesn't believe that miracles take place, if miracles are, if miracles do happen, do you believe that they raise the probability of God's existence? Yes or no?
No, I don't think they do. And I think the reason why I don't think they do is looking at the definitions I gave for miracles themselves is they're very, very vague, and they cross boundaries between kind of being attributable to God and being parts of other things like the law of very large numbers, and even the biblical miracles cross these boundaries. They don't. You don't just have a set of biblical miracles that fall into all very, very easily can just demonstrate God or be attributable to God. Even the most stringent of them in that respect, it still leaves us open to, was it God? Was it God, or is there another candidate explanation? For example, someone could be raised from the dead, which is the one I gave in the kind of the strictest sense of the term. How do we know that that was God? Even if it was outside of our present understanding of how someone could come back from the dead, how do we know that there isn't a naturalistic explanation? How do we know that it wasn't aliens who've transported down and just used their magic alien life zapper on the person? We're already, by saying it has to be God, we're already making a massive, massive leap into that. So I don't think, that was one of the kind of the things that I noted down that I thought was a bit strange, that we're saying, it has to come from God to begin with anyway. You know, why presuppose God, even if it is true that a miracle, the biblical miracles happened? Why presuppose God into that?
Yeah. So the way that I would look at this particular situation, or at least your answer, is so then what you've got to do is you have to say that it's more probable than not that if a miracle exists, or if miracles take place, then it's more likely one of these other candidates than say.
No. What we have to do is we have to establish that God is a candidate explanation to begin
Right.
with.
So
we know that nature exists, right? So
Right.
let's take the alien example for just to begin with. Okay, we know that there are life. We know that life exists on planets because we have an example of it here. We know that there are other planets in the universe. We know that life on other planets can make technology. We know all these things are already possible. These things are
possible doesn't
already
equal
possible.
probable, Richard. Possible
But
doesn't
no,
equal
but
probable.
we haven't even established the possibility of God.
But you haven't.
You're just presupposing that God exists.
But what I'm saying is one of the things that you look at when you look at the proposition are miracles evidence for the existence of God. And what I'm saying is you're critiquing the claim. What I'm saying is if miracles happen, then that raises the probability for the evidence of God, given.
Why?
Okay, here's why. Because when you look at particular miracles, specifically biblical miracles, as you're talking about, there is a theological, historical context. If someone just came to me and said, a miracle took place and it was of, or something non-natural or something weird happened that was of no consequence, then that would raise my skepticism that, God was intervened. But when you talk about Sarah and Abraham having children in old age, Sarah was 100, Abraham was 90. I don't know of anybody in history that's ever had children at the age of 90 and 100. When you talk about Jesus walking or turning water into wine, I don't know of anybody that at least I can recall that has changed water into wine. And all of these things are done not in isolation. They're not done in isolation. They're done with the backdrop of specifically Jesus. Jesus claims, at least in those religious texts that you're talking about, there's a theological narrative and a reason behind these particular things taking place. I just wouldn't take any willy-nilly claim without a religious historical claim to say something like, yeah, God did that, right? So you can say, how do we know that God's candidate? We haven't established that God's possible. Well, if I came to you and we were, sitting around in England and you had a glass of water and I had a glass of water and I said, hey, I just want to let you know, Richard, that God loves you, that God cares for you. And I'm going to demonstrate to you why he does that. And I'm going to say, in the name of Jesus and Yahweh, turn the water into wine. I'm turning the water into wine. Would you say that if that took place, that raises the probability that God exists? Yes or no?
No, because I know that magicians can appear to turn water into wine. We have people who can do that. We literally have people who can do that trick. So the fact that takes place, it tells me nothing whatsoever about raising the possibility of God's existence. And can I just also point out, sorry, I'll let you speak.
Yeah, go ahead.
But you actually said you didn't want to assess any of the biblical claims during this. And then all of a sudden, when it comes to questioning it, you have to go back to the Bible to do that.
No, I don't have to. I'm just saying, you said, well, you made the point that God's not a candidate. And I just used the examples that you mentioned.
No, I didn't say he wasn't a candidate. I said, how do we establish that he is a candidate?
Right. And so I'm just simply saying, I'm just establishing the fact that the miracles that take place that you talked about aren't just done in isolation. They're done with a particular backdrop, right? So part of the reason that we can start to establish that God is a candidate is what's the backdrop of the particular thing taking place, right? Or the particular miracle claim taking place.
The backdrop is a book and a set of beliefs held by people a good couple of thousand years ago. That's the backdrop. It's stories. So what we have to do is establish whether those stories are actually true or not to begin to assess the claim. See, it's not as simple as simply saying, right, we are going to presuppose for this debate that miracles exist, because the miracles given in our examples in the Bible, these can be replicated by other means.
But the definition that you used presupposes that God exists.
Sorry,
no, it doesn't.
Can you check your mic settings? We have a couple people in the audience saying they think you're on the wrong mic.
Was that me? Oh.
No, Dean. So
Okay.
if you go to settings and then go to audio and look what your mic is selected as.
How's that?
I mean, I can't tell the difference, but it seemed fine to me before. So yeah, I guess just go ahead and continue.
Yeah, so one of the things I did do in try and set out in the opening, I don't know whether maybe it was me not being clear, was the fact that the miracle claims that we are presupposing are actually really confusing, given even the Christian definition of them.
I would reject the Catholic definition of a miracle.
You reject it?
Yeah, I would go with the definition that I used in my opening. That's why I used it in my opening.
So you'd say that a miracle isn't a sign or a wonder, such as a healing or control of nature, which can only be attributed to divine power.
Right. So what I'm saying a miracle is to be more general, and I think it would be more fair, actually, would be to say, as I said in my opening, that a miracle is an event. A miracle is an event that would not have happened if the natural world were left to itself. Right. So that's fairly general. That doesn't. I think the Catholic definition is. I think it's almost it's almost too prejudiced towards the divine. Right. So
I mean, your definition though could include things that are influenced by people and technology, could it not? If it's just left to the natural world, if it's something that's just outside of the natural world occurring.
Yeah, you'd have to. Well, that's why you would do the investigation of the particular claim, right? You would say, hey, if you said,
but again, that's something you said we didn't need to do during this debate to define a miracle, and yet it seems as we actually dismantle this.
Miracle. No, you're defining the miracle as this particular thing. But what I'm simply saying is the question itself: are miracles evidence of God? Presupposes that something non-natural already exists, right? And then you take something that's non-natural. So what you have to do is you have to say, how does this non-natural event not raise the probability that God exists, right? So how do you do that? How do you say, here's this non-natural event, right?
I'm still stuck on your definition of miracle here. The definition. Let's take the particular line from the Catholic definition which I used, which can only be attributed to a divine power. Do you agree with that particular line that a miracle, let's say specifically a biblical miracle, can only be attributable to a divine power?
A biblical miracle can only be attributed to a divine power?
Yeah, that's part of the Catholic definition of a miracle.
Well, I see, and here's where I disagree with the Catholic definition, is while I affirm biblical miracles, I think that there are things that can take place that someone might say is a miracle, but really isn't a miracle, right? So for instance, the Catholic might say something like, Well, and I've heard Catholics say this. I've got Catholic friends that have said this. I've had friends just talking the other day with somebody down in Farmville, said, hey, listen, here's a miracle. A buddy of mine years ago was driving down the road, got into a car wreck, pancaked the car, and it was a miracle that he survived. Now, he's using that definition. He's saying in that definition, like, this is the only way that he survived that is because of God. It's something that is outside the scope of probability, possibility. There's no way he should have there's no way he should have survived that. Therefore, God. See, now I wouldn't agree with that. I wouldn't say that in and of itself is a miracle the way that the Catholic has defined it. That's why I'm sticking with a more general claim about what a miracle is. Now, do I affirm biblical miracles? Yeah, but that's outside the scope of what the actual question is talking about tonight.
But do you think a biblical miracle can only be attributed to a divine power?
Yeah, I affirm that biblical miracles like Jesus raising from the dead, given the theo-historical context of which it took place, is an affirmation that Jesus rose from the dead, that the claims that he made about himself are true. But once again, that's outside the scope of what we're talking about.
No, it's not, because that's actually the definition that I used specifically, which you said you didn't agree with. Now you seem to be saying that you do agree with it.
You're conflating what I'm objecting to and what I'm affirming, but what I'm actually arguing about tonight. Yes, I affirm that biblical miracles have taken place. My issue with the Catholic Church definition is
The Catholic Church definition I'm using specifically says it can only be attributed to a divine power. You don't seem to be affirming this specifically. Do you think that biblical miracles such as the resurrection can only be attributable to a divine power? Yes, this is the question that we're asking. Are they evidence of God's existence?
But the problem that you're missing here, Richard, is that I'm seeking to clarify why I don't affirm, why I'm not defending the Catholic definition, given the example that I've said. And then you're jumping back and you're saying, oh, well, that's exactly what a biblical...
Yeah, but the example you gave us,
miracle is, right?
Neither here nor there to the conversation. You gave an example of somebody one of your friends who happens to be a Catholic making a claim.
I think Jesus rose from the dead. Yes, I think Jesus rose from the dead. Do I think that the reason for that is because of God? Yes, I do. The question at hand tonight is, are miracles evidence for the existence of God? You've said that even if a miracle took place, that wouldn't mean that God did it. So what I'm asking is, how do you establish a non-natural event in which that doesn't raise the probability of God's existence? That's what you have to answer.
We haven't established that they're non-natural events. This is why I raised the example about the aliens.
Right. So
you've not established that that's not the case.
Right. So then you're just so in order to get around the miracle claim or the non-natural claim, you're simply appealing to high advanced alien species.
No, I'm giving another candidate explanation, which you don't seem to have taken into account, which actually seems to be more likely, given what we do know about the natural world, than God. We know life comes on planets. We know that life can be form technology. We know this is the case. We have not got that evidence for God.
Okay. So then what I'll seek to show through the rest of the conversation is that you're just presupposing naturalism to get around the miracle claim.
No, I'm not presupposing. I'm asking the question.
So here's the question. Okay, so this will help me figure out your position. What would convince you that a miracle had taken place? What standard of evidence would convince you that a miracle has taken place?
See, that depends on what you mean by miracle again.
Okay,
if we're going by the Catholic definition that it's only attributable to God, which you seem to be kind of agreeing with and not agreeing with, depending on what mood takes you. If I'm honest,
I'm simply clarifying why I disagree with the definition, Richard.
Can we define how we're both accepting a miracle?
Well, and that's the thing. Richard wants me to accept the definition that he gave, And I'm simply saying that definition is too prejudicial. I want a more general.
I'm merely asking. I'm merely asking regarding that definition. If you accept that it can only come from God, a miracle can only come from God, and you seem to be jumping about on that. It's a very, very simple question. Is Jesus being raised from the dead only attributable to God? I mean, it's a yes or no answer. It shouldn't really, take much thinking about.
From my wife about the kid. Sorry. So I'm simply saying the definition that I'm using for miracle is one in which it's an event that simply would not happen given nature being left to itself. So for instance, I don't know what the rate of.
So TV's been made a miracle in your view then, because that's not nature being left to itself, is it?
Sure it is. Natural beings like you and I, which are within the natural world, make TVs, Richard. So that's within the scope of the natural world, right? So that's not something that's non-natural. We're people of ingenuity, so that wouldn't count. So I'll play nice. So I'll go ahead, and to get the answer to this particular question about what would convince Richard of a miracle, I'll go ahead. For that question, I'll accept Richard's definition and say, okay, it's attributable. It's a event that's attributed to God. All right. So if the miracle is something that can only be attributed to God, then given the proposition, isn't it evidence for God's existence? I mean, other than the fact that maybe the Catholic is begging the question with that definition. So given your definition of a miracle, what would convince you that a miracle took place?
What would convince me that a miracle took place? I think the only way to really answer to that is to examine some miracles. You've got to you would have to examine specific miracle claims in order to do that.
Okay, so then what for you would? So you're saying in order for me to accept that a miracle took place, you'd have to provide me miracles, but you still haven't given me a standard by which you are filtering that through to arrive at a miracle.
Well, if we examined miracles, which you didn't want to do, apparently at the outset of the show, I think we'd be able to. I'm just
playing nice now because I want you to answer that question.
I think we could look at the specifics of those claims, and I think that's the only way you could do it. You can't simply say, if a vortex appeared in front of me on the screen now, we couldn't just say miracle God. We'd have to look at other candidate explanations for it.
So let me think can I give you a hypothetical?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so if you and I, we were in Sheffield, England, it's a clear night sky, and then a meteor hits the moon and it says, Richard, Yahweh exists, repent from your sins. Would you say that was a miracle?
I'd have to examine the evidence.
But you saw it, right? We were both there. We saw it.
Are humans not prone to seeing things that aren't there and having delusions?
Well, then you have to have a really good defeater for your natural senses deceiving you. Like you'd have to have, simple seeing is, one of the ways in which we survive, right? I'm not, and plus, given that scenario, what good reason would you have for believing that you were deluded? So this is just
the very fact that the way our brains work, we don't see what's actually technically in front of us. So a large part of what we see, this is going off topic a little bit, I didn't really want to do this, but a large part of what we see and how we interact with the world around us is built on previous experience. So when we see, it's not like a video camera. When we see the world, we're not taking in exactly what's in front of us. What we're doing is we're constructing an image from previous experience. That's how our brains work. So if we've had, for example, we might have watched a film about meteors crashing into the moon. We might have just been to a sermon talking about Yahweh, these all form part of our things, our experience in life. And if that event occurred, it could easily, in fact, is probably more likely, because we know these things occur, be a delusion than Yahweh writing our name in his name in the moon via a meteor.
Okay. So then really what you're saying is I reject miracles.
What I'm saying is we'd have to investigate the event. It's not enough. Right. It's really, really poor quality thinking to just assume that it's a miracle and it's from God just because we believe it has happened.
No, I'm not doing that. What I'm saying is...
But you're asking me to do that. You're asking me if I would accept that as evidence.
Well, the issue is I'm trying to get a standard by which you would accept that a miracle had taken place. And you're saying, well, throw me some miracles. But then you're saying, well, if it is a possible miracle, I could be deluded. Therefore, it's not a miracle. And so it's
I'm not saying it's not a miracle. I'm saying we'd have to investigate it.
Right. Okay. So give me a hypothetical. Give me a standard by which you would say if this took place, a miracle would have happened.
I don't know, because we'd have to investigate the thing.
So you don't have a standard. So how can you say that this isn't a miracle when you come to the table and you just don't have a standard of what a miracle claim would look like? So it's like saying, it's like going to a sword fight, with a piece of paper and saying, you know what, I'm not sure that that's a sword. And then you say, well, how do you know that? Well, I don't know. I don't have a standard by which to measure or to.
I don't have a standard because we've never witnessed a miracle as far as we know.
If I can interject, how do you know that? Dean, the audience is looking for clarification on how you're defining miracle.
I said for this particular question that Richard is asked, or that I'm seeking to ask Richard, I'm using his definition. And Richard just made a mistake. Richard just said, we've never seen a miracle that we know of. And he's simply appealing to his own particular experiences, when in all actuality, there are people who have said miracles have taken place. So he's appealing to
yes, they are. So let's investigate those claims.
It's a classic Humean.
Let's investigate those claims, which is what you said at the outset you did not want to do.
Where you say the uniformity of our experience says there aren't any miracles, but he's appealing to just his uniform experience, not everybody else's.
No, I said that we know of.
So Richard doesn't have a standard by which he would say that he's seen a miracle, but now he's going to say, well, in every hypothetical that you give me, that's not a miracle. So I just want people to understand that.
No. Please don't put words into my mouth.
I'm not.
I operate on the basis. I operate on the basis of if there is a good reason to believe something, then we accept it.
Okay.
I've not said that
any believe a miracle took place.
You what? Sorry.
You don't have one.
I don't think you have one.
I'm giving you I've said, hey, what's your reasonable experience or standard by which you would say that a miracle has taken place?
We'd have to investigate the particular claim.
Richard, you don't see it. You're saying how do you know that a miracle took place? And you're saying, well, we have to investigate it. But then when we investigate it, how do we investigate it? And you're like, well, I don't know. I don't have a standard.
No, I'm not saying I don't know. We don't have a standard. We have standards by which we can investigate things.
Hey, let me give you another.
I've just given you standards in the previous example you gave. We know that people can be deluded. That is a standard we can use to investigate the claim.
Okay, so then...
So don't tell me that I don't have a standard when I've just given you one.
Okay, so then what would make you think that you weren't deluded and saw a miracle? Like, to be deluded, to be delusional is a serious situation of the mind. So you have to provide good reasons why your cognitive functions have failed to the point where you're deluded in this one particular case, but not in these other particular cases.
Yes, I would.
Like you're just saying,
that's correct. That is the standard by which we'd use. We have standards by which we can investigate whether someone is deluded.
Okay. So if you came to the conclusion that you and I weren't deluded, would you agree that a miracle had taken place?
Yeah, if the evidence was there that there was no delusion taking place and that had actually happened,
Okay. So
but that is a standard we can use to investigate the claim. I reject completely that I don't have a standard. It's just not the standard you accept, which, from my perspective, is quite a low standard.
no, my
Someone
standard is
wrote
simply
about it
my
in a
standard
book
is simply
1,000
the
years
Thomas
ago.
Reed standard of and this is not a pejorative. But Thomas Reed said, "Hey, we have this idea. It's called common sense epistemology. Unless I have really good reasons to doubt my cognitive perceptions, I'm well within my rights to accept that a particular thing has taken place."
So if a meteor hit the moon and wrote, Richard, this is a message from Yahweh, you don't think that's a good enough reason to doubt my perceptions?
Say what?
If given your scenario that a meteor hit the moon and carved my name out and said it was from Yahweh, you don't think that's a good enough reason to doubt my perceptions? Because I think it's a very good reason to doubt my perceptions.
Well, here I guess the one thing that I would say is if you and I are together and we both see the same thing, then there's a good chance we either may both be deluded or we may both be seeing the correct thing. Now, if there's a multitude of people, say 50, that see it, I still think that raises the probability that a miracle has taken place. If a multitude of good eyewitness testimony happens, then I'm cool with saying, Richard, Jesus, Yahweh just sent you a message.
That's a really low standard, though, because again, we know that people have group delusions. We know that these things occur. These are documented things. So we know these things happen. So it's a very, very low standard just to say, well, a number of people have seen it, therefore it's true.
Right. You'd have to also, and I think you'd have to do, and I think that's a fair point. I think you'd have to do a little bit more investigation with regards to that. But I think if they check out and they're not deluded, we're good to go, right? We're good to go with like a miracle just took place.
Well, yeah, but like as I said, there's a standard you'd have to go through to get to that conclusion. It seems to be a standard that you're just completely avoiding and jumping straight to miracle.
So help me understand here. I'll give you a chance to fire some questions at me. I was pretty hard on you there. So, why would that particular scenario? Or I guess my question would be, what would be the evidence that I was deluded in that scenario? Just the fact that I saw it, or is there something else to consider?
Well, there are lots and lots of things to consider. I mean, that's something that you'd have to look at particular examples from psychology and neurology and things like that to account for. So I mean, you'd have to look at, as I say, there are ways of investigating it and seeing if that's the case. But I'm very interested, Dean, that you. I'm going to turn the tables a bit now.
Go ahead. Go for it.
I'm very interested that you're coming up with these kind of elaborate scenarios when we actually have miracle claims in the Bible, and from the outset you didn't seem to want to investigate those. Why go to an elaborate, a meteor hits the moon and spells out my name when we actually have miracle claims in the Bible that we could just go into?
Right. No. So I just did that as an exaggeration to make a point. That's all that was. Nothing particularly against you. One of the reasons why I didn't go into the, miracle claims in the Bible is because I'm not convinced that the proposition warrants that. It's just a matter of what is the definition of a miracle? Here's the definition of a miracle. And if we agree on that definition, does that particular instance raise the probability of God's existence or not? And I think that, the definition that you've given, while I disagree with it, I think it's a little bit too prejudicial towards, I think it might be a little bit too prejudicial towards theism. I like a more general, neutral definition. But now that I think about it, if we take my definition and your definition, all we have to do is just ask the question: what's the definition of a miracle? Here's the definition of a miracle. All right, does that raise the probability that God exists? Okay, well, the answer is either yes or no. And so if you say no, then you have to show why this particular definition doesn't raise the probability of God's existence, right? And I mean, that's the only reason why I didn't go into the biblical claims, because I don't think the proposition warrants that.
But every example you've thrown at me is pretty much an example which is parallel to a biblical claim. It's just outside the Bible, so we can't look at the Bible to investigate it.
Yeah, so I mean, you could look at other non-natural events that wouldn't happen with nature left to itself. Like, for instance, if we were at the top of a hill and we had 3 massive boulders and we pushed them and they went down the hill, and as they're going down the hill, another boulder comes rolling up the hill, right? That would be a non-natural event.
No, that wouldn't be a non-natural event. There's nothing in physics that says all the atoms in that boulder couldn't all move in the same direction at the same time. It's unlikely, it's improbable, but it's not impossible in physics that could actually happen.
But you would agree there's a difference between possibility and probability, right?
Yeah, but that's not the point. The point is that could occur in nature. And you've just said that would be a non-natural event, which is not the case.
Okay, so a non-natural.
This is the difficulty you're facing, is that any scenario has to be investigated. It can't just be ascribed as miracle, which it seems to be the thing that you're doing. Let's just ascribe it as a miracle and then say miracles prove God. It's not as easy as doing that.
But it seems like you're just saying, regardless of how wild this particular scenario may be, there's this small percentage of possibility that says that this could take place in nature, and therefore, no matter what radical.
Well, I have to do that because you're saying that this couldn't happen in nature.
It just seems to me that's just a prejudice towards naturalism. So then I guess my question,
when your argument is that this could not happen in nature, therefore it's God, any probability that it could happen in nature needs to be looked at seriously, no matter how unlikely. Wouldn't you agree?
No, I think things need to be investigated. I'm not against investigation. I guess my question now is just like, okay, well, what event, and maybe this is back to another issue. Is there any event that you would consider something that would be, not within the scope of the possibility in nature?
I don't know. Not that I know of.
Okay,
really quick, whoever's notifications keep going off, can you silence that?
I'm doing all I can over here. Sorry.
He's a very popular man. Is our Dean Meadows?
I don't know. I just got a bunch of people. My iPhone is connected to my computer.
I thought you were going to go into the kind of Skeleton Bones song. Then my iPhone's connected to my.
Maybe that'll do it. Does anybody know how to? Anybody in the chat tell the old? I'm a 35-year-old boomer.
There should be a silence button on the side of the phone.
If I turn my phone off, does it go off?
Well, no. If you turn your phone off, it'll be fine.
Okay, I'll just turn my phone off and not have to deal with it. Sorry about that. My bad.
Thank you.
As we used to say.
Okay. So
still doing it. Goodness gracious.
I don't think you turned it off, Dean.
Dude, my phone is off. Phone is off.
Okay. Well,
I don't know what to do other than let me see here. Options. I don't know. I'm sorry.
All right,
let's tell everybody to stop texting. Maybe I'll just remove myself. I don't know.
Oh, do you have iMessage open?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Close that.
Just like hit preferences or quit messages.
just exit out of the thing altogether.
I thought young people knew how to use technology.
Bro, I am. Listen, I tell this to everybody. I'm a millennial, trapped in a boomer's body. All right, I have no idea how to work technology.
So let's not just go at each other about this. One of the problems I had was that even if we accept miracle claims, that still doesn't prove exclusively the Christian God.
Right. I'm not arguing for the Christian God. That was in my opening. I'm not arguing for that. I'm arguing for a general idea that God exists because I want to be fair. I want to be fair to the possible candidates of this God. I simply said, hey, general theism, a being that has particular attributes with regards to knowledge, knowledge, power, and moral orientation.
Okay, let's even take that then, because I don't even think that's
and once again, sorry,
that being is necessarily the case for if we look at miracle claims in general. It doesn't have to be specifically a God of that description. I was hoping to steelman you a little bit and give you an example of as to why this is the case. And let's stick with Christianity, because I think this is a real problem for Christianity. If miracle claims are evidence of God's existence, and other religions, or let's say miracle claims are evidence of Christian God's existence, and other religions, even ones that have a God that isn't described in such a way as that, have miracles that follow the same independent yardstick, that is a problem because they can't mutually exist together.
All right, sorry, I was telling people to stop texting me because of the notifications. I'm sorry, Richard. Could you do me a favor and just repeat that? I'm extremely sorry.
Yeah, so let's use the Christian God because it's easier to do that, but it actually applies to different God claims as well that don't fall into the kind of category that you described in your opening. But if we use just the Christian God, because it just makes it easier to do this, because then we can actually give specific examples that contradict that. So if we have a yardstick by which to measure a miracle claim by, a specific miracle claim, and other traditions have that same yardstick met, but they are contradictory gods or contradictory traditions, then that is a problem, even if miracles are true, is it not?
So, one, I would just say, I think that's outside of the scope of the discussion, but
I don't. I think it's very much the core of the discussion.
But for the sake of being a nice chap, we can discuss this for a little bit.
Well, let me give you an example of why it's I think it's vital to the discussion.
One last time. The audience is again asking for clarification, so maybe this can come from you, Dean. What was the definition of miracles again? How do we know they exist or happen? So by your standard, or how would you define it?
So the definition that I use in my opening is that a miracle is an event that would not have happened if the natural world were left to itself. Now, that's not the definition that Richard used. We tussled a while over those definitions, which I assume that we would do. But what was the second part of the question?
And how do we know they exist / happen?
Right. So how do we know that miracles exist / happen? I think the short answer to that, as Richard has said over and over again, is we do an investigation of those particular claims, and there have been scholars that have, gone down this road and said, this is how we could establish that a miracle has taken place. Guys like Lacona, guys like Tim McGrew. And if we want to get into those, we can have that particular conversation, if Richard wants to do that, that's fine. I don't.
Well, I'd love to go into. I'd absolutely love to go into the resurrection.
I don't think that's within the scope of the particular question tonight, because the question tonight, I think, presupposes that miracles take place. The question is, does the miracle taking place raise the probability of God's existence? Which I think, whether you use my definition or Richard's definition, I think it does. But that's here nor there. So one of the things that we could ask about a particular a miracle claim, any miracle claim with regards to any religion, would be something like, all right, is the claim distant from the event? So one of the examples of that would be like the writing about Apollonius of Tyana, right? The writing that took place about Apollonius of Tyana and the miracle claims weren't even around the area in which Apollonius of Tyana, historically lived. They're talking about Apollonius of Tyana doing all these things in India. So does the claim of what the person did actually match where the person lived, right? Would you agree with that, Richard?
I would agree with that. And I think the thing is, the reason I wanted to kind of push this specific route specifically, and why I said let's talk about Christianity specifically rather than a general God claim, although it doesn't really have to be a general God claim, because there is still problems with that. But one of the reasons I wanted to talk about Christianity specifically, because if we look at different claims and they all match the criteria, then this is if we're saying that a miracle is evidence for God's existence, or specifically the Christian God's existence, or the Islamic God, or whatever God it is, if we're saying that they are evidence for that God's existence, yet several contradictory religions meet that criteria, then there's a real problem, because it cannot be any longer used as evidence for that specific God's existence.
Right. That may be just the issue of epistemology rather than ontology, right? Like that could be the issue of, how do we know which one of these is true, rather than, okay, well, maybe there's this God that exists and we have an epistemology.
Well, this is why I wanted to go try and steelman you, so to see if you agreed with the kind of the yardstick I was using, shall we say?
Right. No, and I think you raise a interesting question there for sure, but I don't necessarily know that rules out the existence of a general God. It very well may. It very well may be the situation where.
But would it not rule out a specific God?
Potentially, unless one could establish that a particular God has morally sufficient reasons for enacting a miracle in another religion. So for instance, like Nabil Qureshi, the late Nabil Qureshi, whether we believe him or not about his conversion, he was an active Muslim and converted to Christianity, after a vision. Now, I don't know if that's what you're talking about. That might be completely different, but that would be an instance where, if true, you would have the Christian God acting within the Islamic religious framework in order to convert somebody.
But it wouldn't mean the Islamic God was also true by the same yardstick, would it?
Real quick. So while I'm going to save the questions for the end, there are some clarifying questions I may need to occasionally interject. Richard, I have one for you.
Okay.
What do you mean by investigating in this context? Surely you'd have some type of defined standard beyond the catch-all term. Tell me these steps.
I'm not quite sure what is meant by that. I mean, let me try to have a stab at it, and if it's not what the question is kind of meaning, then let him come back. What I mean is, if an event is witnessed that we think could possibly be a miracle, then we'd have to investigate whether that was the case or not. So, for example, with the case in the moon, is there any delusion going on? Is there any kind of cognitive dissonance going on? Is there any intoxication? There are lots and lots of different candidate explanations rather than jumping straight at the, oh yeah, this is a miracle. So we could investigate each one of those and, find out whether they were in fact the case before jumping to miracle.
Right.
I don't know if that answered the
the way
question.
that I would elaborate on that question, because I think I've asked it before, is but what are the specific steps by which you would go through and investigate the miracle claim? I know that you said you'd have to rule out whether someone was deluded or not. Like, how would you figure that out? And
well, we have standards by which to do that. We have psychologists, we have neurologists who can look into those things and see if that's the case, see if any kind of delusion is going on, if any kind of intoxication has been taken. That's a pretty easy one to rule out. You're usually quite sure if you've had something to drink or not, but it is nevertheless a candidate explanation. And, work through them systematically, the possibilities that could be impeding your perception.
And so you would say if someone went through a psychological eval to see if they were deluded or something like that and they passed it.
I'd think if it was me, I'd want to go through that to see if I was deluded.
Right.
You know what I mean? I mean, we have examples of, both ghost attacks and alien abductions where there are, actual physiological explanations that can be given for these things. Yet a lot of people bypass those and automatically go to, I've been abducted by an alien or I've been attacked by a ghost. Yet we have physiological explanations which could account for these things. So look at those candidate explanations and see if they've taken place first before jumping to the most extreme kind of explanation. I think that's what any reasonable person would do. I wouldn't understand why, if you'd witnessed something, you wouldn't want to eliminate those things on anyway before jumping to, ghost attack, alien abduction, miracle. Why wouldn't you want to investigate it and eliminate that?
Yeah, no, I'm not against investigation. I guess my other question, with regards to this particular topic, as far as investigating miracle claims, would be, do you think that any non-natural events are possible? And what would one of those be for you?
I don't know. I think that possibility would have to be demonstrated. I'm not against the idea, but as at the minute, as I understand things, they're outside of my scope to even imagine. So it'd have to be demonstrated to be possible first. So do you think I'll just clarify, I shouldn't say out of my scope to imagine, because I can imagine some pretty wild things, but I mean within the realms of what we actually know and experience.
So and so I think that's what makes it maybe I don't want to say difficult, but I think that's where I'm trying to struggle, or I'm not trying to struggle. Where I'm struggling here is because it seems like when I say, okay, well, here's my definition of a miracle, here's your definition of a miracle, it seems like on either one of those definitions, they raise the probability. Not saying that they make it certain that God exists. I'm simply saying it raises the probability. What that probability is, I'm not sure. I'm no mathematician. I don't do Bayes' theorem either. And so it's like, here's the miracle. Here's the definition of a miracle. We argue, we squabble about it. All right. On my definition, your definition, these things are non-natural events, or these are divine, these are actions that can only be explained by God. So both of those seem to raise the probability that God exists, but you're saying, no, they don't, because we haven't established that God's a candidate. And then we come down and we say, all right, well, what's your standard for that? And you basically have said, what would convince you? Like, well, throw me some miracles. I don't know that is a miracle. Then we're coming down and we're saying, okay, well, you have to investigate that. Well, how would you investigate that? Here's how I would investigate that. Then we're saying, all right, well, what would, you're saying that it's possible for non-natural events to take place, but you don't know of an example of a non-natural event that would convince you a non-natural event took place. And so I guess that's where I'm struggling, is like, how can you say that a miracle doesn't raise the probability? And I see why maybe you say that a miracle doesn't raise the probability of God's existence, because it's one of those things where no matter where we go with regards to the definition of a miracle, how to investigate a miracle, non-natural events, you're saying, not just I don't know, I just don't have a standard. And I think that is the issue.
There is a standard by which we can investigate it. We've been through this already. There is a standard by which we can investigate something.
Okay. So then I guess my question would be, let's take time. I'll be nice. I won't hold. I'll stop saying that this is outside of the scope of the topic. Let's pare down.
Before we do that, can we just go back a few steps, because I don't feel we've sufficiently investigated this cross-religious idea. Yeah,
sure.
And there is a specific example I actually had in mind, which was the resurrection, and we can go deeply into the resurrection in many, many different ways if you want. But I want to start generally first, just as a general scope, and see if you agree with this. So I'm assuming we agree with scholars on a couple of things regarding the resurrection accounts. One is that there are no contemporary extra biblical accounts from any source attesting to the resurrection. Would you agree with that? So there are no extra biblical sources from the time of the resurrection which talk about the resurrection.
Sure. Not that I know of. I'll just say that. Not that I know of.
We do have later accounts that attest to Christians believing what is written in the Gospels. So Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, for example, they were writers who wrote about it afterwards that said Christians believed these things. Would you agree with that?
About Tacitus and who else did you say? Pliny?
Pliny the Younger. I mean, I've just plucked two names out of the air.
Yeah, they describe particular religious practices and beliefs of early Christians. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So before the gospel accounts were written, the information would have been passed down orally to the authors.
They were either passed down or literally the authors. Is that what you're saying?
Before the gospel accounts were literally written down, then that information would have been originally transmitted orally.
Most of it would have, but we have texts that predate the Gospels. So the argument,
I know we have texts. I'm talking about specifically the gospel accounts.
They would have had potential access to other written documents, but there certainly were oral traditions, no doubt.
They were, or they weren't.
No, they would have had access to written accounts, written text, but also there were oral traditions that were passed down.
Okay, so there were oral traditions, yeah. And they are also, this might be a bit confusing, so try and bear with me. They are authentic representations of the biblical account. So what I'm trying to say there is that the people who wrote them believed that they were true. So that the people who wrote the Gospels believed that what they were writing were true. They weren't just making shit up as far as they understood it.
Yeah. I think that when you look at something like Luke chapter 1, Luke seems to be, I'll be more generous. The author of Luke seems to be saying that these are eyewitness accounts of what's going on.
Right. So, and given those things regarding the resurrection, those standards, do you think that is reason enough And like I said, we can investigate them in more detail if you want. But would you say that that's reasonable enough to suggest that the resurrection was an actual historical event that took place, an actual miracle event in history that took place?
That someone wrote it down and they believe
Given those standards I've just given you and that you've just agreed to, would you say that that's enough to believe that the resurrection account is true?
So
As criteria.
So we went through three. One was that they wrote it down and they believed it was true.
There were no extra biblical accounts from the time of the resurrection. Later people did write about it and attest to Christians believing that what was written was true. Before the accounts were written down, they'd have been passed on orally to the authors, and that when the authors wrote them, they genuinely believed that that was the case.
Right.
Would you say that's enough to say that the resurrection account occurred as a historical thing, as a standard?
Right. So in general, I would say that I don't know that it would be enough. You'd have to look at when the documents were written, the distance of the documents between the event. Are there anything within the documents that suggest some type of early oral tradition or anything like that?
But given if those things were correct, then that would be enough to. This is what I'm trying to get at. This is the point I'm trying to drill down to. If that was the case, then that would be enough to accept the resurrection as true.
No, what I'm saying is,
I can't think of anything outside of that is usually cited. And of course, we can go into the details of them, but I can't think of anything outside of that is usually cited as confirming the resurrection is true.
So I'll just repeat what I said earlier. In general, without doing any investigation into the documents, extra biblical sources that don't talk about a resurrection and people writing stuff down believing it's true isn't enough for me to say that the resurrection took place.
Right. So, but what is it then that does make you believe it? Because that is kind of the criteria given in virtually every conversation I've seen, even with yourself.
No,
when you drill down to it, that's the criteria.
People writing things down and believing that it's true doesn't make it true, right? So as we look at these particular things with regards to like the writers, the question you have to ask is, and this is one of the things that I have in my notes about any miracle claim, what's the distance between the event? Is the writer in a position and writing accurately about, in general, who the person was and where they were? So like I go back to my example of Apollonius of Tyana. These miracles are taking place in India. Apollonius of Tyana was never in India, right? So is that taking place with Jesus? Are we saying Jesus is over here? Is Luke saying, hey, is Jesus over here like doing miracles in China? Okay, well, those are the only place that he did miracles. Well, we know historically Jesus was never in China, right? As far as his existence and ministry goes. So that's one thing that I would look at. So we see that in the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Jesus is and other writings, Jesus is generally in the same place, same ministry, fits the time frame, fits the cultural narratives of the day, fits the political situation of the day with the Jews and Romans. So at least for that piece of, is this guy in the right place at the right time of what's being accurately or what's being described? Yes. All right. So
but you've only got the biblical accounts that put Jesus there. You don't have any extra biblical accounts.
Yeah. You have one piece of that. I'd have to go back and look at Tacitus and Pliny to see if they, and maybe I don't, see if they mention anything about, well, I mean, I think I don't know, I have to look and see if any of the Roman historians talk about Christians being in Jerusalem during that time frame. Certainly the destruction of the temple in AD 70 is something that is mentioned, but anyways, so that's one thing that I would look at with regards to that. I would ask the question of the miracle claim. Does the miracle simply confirm opinions that have already been established? Right. So for instance, you look at the sainthood of Pope John Paul II, right? You need 3 miracles essentially in Catholicism. You probably know more about this than I do, Richard. You need 3 miracles that have been attested to by people. Okay, well, does that confirm opinions with regards to sainthood that have already been established, recorded, or known? Opinions about Pope John Paul II that are present and known.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm trying to establish your criteria here, not somebody else's.
No. That's what
this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to establish your criteria for whether the gospel accounts and the other accounts of Paul's letters and things are sufficient to say that this miracle of Jesus' resurrection is a historical miracle. It actually happened. Is it sufficient to demonstrate that happened to you?
Right. No, and I'm walking you through what would make a miracle claim. I guess I don't want to say.
Well, we have a specific miracle claim here. We don't have to jump to a different one. We have a specific miracle claim we're talking about.
No, I'm simply using examples to drive home the point. Like, this is why I think the resurrection is true based upon the criteria that I'm setting out and using examples to support that. So I'm just simply saying distance of the event, the opinions, does the miracle just affirm opinions that are already in existence? I think the other thing would be, can the miracle be explained by natural events, uncertain events? Can it just be explained equally by natural events as the claim of a miracle, right? Belated reports. So if you have the report of the miracle, and it comes, 500 years after the case, is that a good testament to the miracle probably happened? No. Trivial events, there's no significant purpose behind it. Stephen Law gives this example when he's talking about it. And then self-serving events. Does it serve obvious human motivations? So
talk me through this confirmed beliefs that are already held, because that seems a little bit circular. If you're saying the gospel accounts confirm beliefs that are already held, well, the gospel accounts largely.
Yeah. So when you look at the gospels, they're supposedly testimonies of what took place with regards to Jesus' ministry, but within the context of Jesus' ministry, it was not an established opinion that the Messiah would die and rise again amongst your first century Jew. It was not. The Messiah was supposed to be the strong-arm warlord that kicked the Romans out and returned to the glory days of Israel.
I'm still a little bit lost, because you seem to be saying, well, actually, there was dissenting opinion, so therefore it's not actually very strong to say that this confirms that it actually happened.
No, it would, because what is being established or what is being recorded is not something that simply goes along with what was an established opinion or belief about Messiah in the first century, right? So if there is a miracle that Jesus did a miracle, and it was something of the sort of in one fell swoop, he said, "Rome be gone." All the Romans, died, and he established his political throne that day and sat on the throne, returned Israel to the days of David. I don't know that would convince me, because that's what just about every single Jew during that time frame believed Messiah was about. That's what I mean by the miracle doesn't establish already held opinions, by the people who are claiming the miracle.
So you seem to be saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure you will, that because people had different opinions, that actually makes the case for it stronger.
Well, I think when you look at the particular way in which Jesus' ministry went, it was his particular, the miracle claim about Jesus' resurrection is not within the held opinion of what Messiah was going to be. Therefore, given that miracle does not establish or reinforce already held opinions, I think it raises the probability that a miracle took place.
Why?
Because it leads to the credence that this particular thing that's taken place is not something that is within the purview of the people of the time. And so because it's not of the purview of the people of the time, given the particular text and the shock of what took place, then you could establish that it's more probable that a miracle took place than someone simply it lowers the probability that someone just made this up, right? So if I was a Jew in the first century and I wanted to say that Jesus was the Messiah for the Jews, and I want to scrub or make him more palatable to Jews, then maybe what I do is I say he wipes out the Romans, and this is what took place.
I hate to keep bringing this back to kind of psychology and neurology, but that's exactly what people do when they're actually making things up. It's well known in psychology that kind of people will, if they want to stand out, if they're making a story up and they want to stand out, they will go against the standard. That's a
right.
well-known.
Well, then you have to establish, and once again, that's not the only piece. It's part of it. It's not the full totality of it. So you say, okay, well, this opinion seems to drive against the opinions of people with regards to what the Messiah was. Now the question is, as we move down the criteria, is it more probable than not that they made it up? Right. So it's not just the particular.
I'm very confused by what it is that convinces you that the resurrection actually. I mean, I didn't expect this to go down this route, to be honest, but I'm very confused as to what actual criteria convinces you that the resurrection took place, because it seems to be. There seems to be a set of criteria which I laid out, which the majority of the Christians I've heard talk, including yourself, seem to have cited as being, good enough to accept the resurrection. In fact, you said yourself, as if I may raise it again, which raised a smile from you earlier, when you spoke on the line with Jimmy Snow and Vila Bianca, the central piece of Christianity is the resurrection. And 1 Corinthians 15 pointed out that if the resurrection is not true, Christianity is false.
Right.
So you seem to have a standard that the resurrection actually occurred and is actually, a central part of this. But when I'm actually trying to dig in and find out what exactly about it convinces you, there doesn't seem to be it seems to be a bit wishy-washy. It doesn't seem to be something that had convinced me.
I don't think that I've been wishy-washy with regards to it. I'm simply trying to lay out the criteria of, how do you establish the probability that a miracle took place, right? And so even on the line with, Vila, Bianca, and Jimmy Snow, you appeal to 1 Corinthians 15. And the reason that you appeal to 1 Corinthians 15 is because it seems to be a very early. Hold up 1 second. Somebody's coming down here. I didn't know who it was. I thought it was one of my kids. It's just my wife saying hi.
Hi,
She's
wife.
waving to everybody. So, so yeah. So even on that, I appeal to 1 Corinthians 15 because unlike the Gospels, and I don't think Gospels are necessarily, bad dates. It's an early oral creed that many scholars say dates back to 7 to 10 years with regards to the event of Jesus' supposed resurrection. So
I mean that's a bit lenient, I think, on your part. I think the generally accepted date is the 50s, and which is a good 20 years.
No, not 1 Corinthians 15. You misheard me.
No, I'm coming to that as Paul's letters. When scholars talk about 1 Corinthians 15, what they seem to think is that it actually predates Paul, and he was basing his letters on that.
So say that again one more time about Paul.
When Paul wrote for the letters of Paul are generally dated in the 50s. That's the generally accepted. There is a group of scholars, and it's certainly not a majority, that think it might be earlier than that, but they think that might actually be earlier writing that Paul based his letters on.
Right. So I haven't looked at that second piece. I would struggle to say that Paul is in like the 30s or the 40s. I'm more specifically talking about the particular creed there in 1 Corinthians 15. That you can have a text that dates 50, but an oral tradition that dates earlier.
Yeah, so, I mean that's part of the criteria that I laid out to you earlier that I think is so important.
That would go along with the belated report event or the belated report criteria that I'm looking at. As you're saying, is this more probable than not? Good.
No, you go on. Sorry, go on.
No, so I mean that's all I mean to say. So,
when we're looking at that, that's again a different. When we're looking at the gospel account, this is another thing. We've got so much things to talk about here, but this. We talk about. I don't want to detract too much, but we talk about eyewitness testimony and things, and that's one of the things that is cited as being, good, because these accounts contain slight differences, which I have my problems with, and we can get into if you like. But Paul's letters seem to 1 Corinthians 15 specifically seems to talk about different criteria than the other gospel accounts. It doesn't mention Mary Magdalene at all being there. It gives a series of people who Jesus appeared to, and that's in an order, and it's completely different to the gospel accounts. And in fact, it seems to be. And I'm going to quote from, if I can find his name, John Barton, who's an Anglican priest and theologian and biblical scholar. And he said in his 2019 book, A History of the Bible, that, just let me find this a minute, because I've got a quite direct quote from him somewhere. Paul seems to imply that his own vision of the risen Jesus was the same as that of all the other early witnesses. And yet he describes it only as a light and hearing a voice. He doesn't actually describe a bodily resurrection.
Well, that's different than 1 Corinthians 15, right? That's Galatians and Acts is what you're citing. So Paul's simply relaying a early oral creed, which by the way, let me get your opinion on this. What do you think the purpose of creeds are?
What do I think the purpose of creeds are? To establish a unified idea.
Okay, so does the unified idea have to? Is it necessary for a creed to get all of every single one of the particulars down in a creed for a creed to capture the main idea? Yes or no?
No, it's not. But I
Okay,
think
so regardless of whether or not 1 Corinthians 15 mentions Mary Magdalene, the two people on the road to Emmaus, or all this, that, and the other, the central idea of the creed and of the Gospels is that Jesus rose from the dead. And so as long as you have a creed that establishes that,
this is the case, but
I don't see why. Hold up 1 second. I don't see why the mentioning or not mentioning of Mary Magdalene is of significance if the purpose of the creed is just to capture a general idea.
But he's actually describing his experience.
In 1 Corinthians 15, he's passing down something that he got from that was delivered to him. That's not his experience in 1 Corinthians 15. Now you could appeal to Acts and Galatians as far as what Paul says, but 1 Corinthians 15, he starts out, I'm reporting to you that was delivered to me, and then he goes into the creed. That's the big difference there. So the creed is the relaying of something that's already been established prior to Paul writing, that Paul is receiving from somebody else. But once again, real quick, are you open for a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so my question would be this, since we're going down the line of historical evidence. Sorry, stretching my back. Like what historical documentation, not just with the resurrection, but historical documentation would you need, or is there any historical documentation or criteria for historical documentation that would lead you to believe that a miracle took place in the past?
I don't think that I've certainly not seen any historical documentation that convinces me of a miracle.
So,
the thing is, when you're looking at historical documentation, you've got to assess it on the basis of there are lots of different ways to assess historical documentation. Very few of those ways to assess talk about miracle claims. Right. So, you've got source analysis, you've got source evaluation. There's, specific ways to actually evaluate a source. You need to formulate judgment about its strengths and weaknesses. You've got to kind of look at whether it's useful, relevant, reliable, or accurate.
So what I'm asking.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, I guess just what I'm asking is there any historical documentation, and maybe this is a two-parter, is there any historical documentation that could be presented to you in which you assessed it and say, yeah, a miracle happened? And maybe the other question is, what would that standard look like for historical documentation?
There are historical documents that claim miracles happened. The standard would be assessing them again. I think you've always got to go back to assessing it, and I agree with you that you've got to assess these things and look at them. This is why I'm trying to kind of, and I don't think we've still kind of got to your kind of nitty gritty about how you actually establish the resurrection occurs. All we've really got so far is that they contain beliefs already held. But you seem to agree with the criteria I gave, and then kind of go off on a tangent.
I would never affirm, Richard. I would never affirm that just because somebody wrote something down and they believed that it was true, that's necessarily so. Like that, I would never affirm that, because I could write something down right now and that I really believe was true, and it could be false. Like I think we both know that just because somebody writes something down and says, well, this happened, that's not necessarily so. The same thing, that's the exact example with Apollonius of Tyana. Somebody wrote it down. They believed that it was, they probably believed that it was true, but upon investigation, we know that Apollonius of Tyana was never in India, right? So, but what I'm trying to say is,
But you have pointed out yourself that if the resurrection is not true,
right,
then
I agree.
Christianity is false. But yet, when I've asked you specifically for the criteria that you'd use for the resurrection, you seem to agree with me in general, but then seem to be going, well, not this.
I can disagree with you. I can agree with you in general and then disagree with you on specifics, right? Yeah. So I just went down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things in which someone can use to identify whether or not a miracle took place. And you're saying, well, you're being wishy-washy on that. And so what I'm simply...
Well, I've still not established what those things are, because, for example, you said, the confirmed beliefs already held, and then you said, well, actually, if they don't confirm beliefs that are already held, then it's more likely.
No, I said the miracle claim drives against opinions that are already held.
I think you should perhaps watch this back, because when you first said it, you actually said that it confirms beliefs that are already held.
No, I'm saying the miracle claim does not confirm beliefs that were already held. I went on this big spiel about how...
No, I know you said that afterwards, but when you first said it, you said that part of the criteria was that it confirmed beliefs that were already held.
That wouldn't make sense, Richard, because then I just went along and said, this is why the resurrection is unique.
I know it doesn't make sense. That's why I'm so confused.
Well, you're confused because
real quick, just heads up, we got about 9 minutes left before we need to open up for audience questions.
Hopefully you'll watch it back and you'll say, hey, he said, the miracle doesn't confirm opinions that are already been established, because I went along and said, this is why Jesus' claim about Messiah and resurrection is so interesting, because it drives against the opinion of what the modern Jew in the first century would have thought about Messiah. Anyways, so what I'm getting at in my question is, like, one, I guess maybe I'll ask it again, and maybe I'm just being overly difficult. So is there a standard by which you would say, here's this historical document or set of documents, and here's the standard that I'm using to say a miracle took place? Because you're saying here, these don't add up to a miracle. I'm simply asking, what are you using to say that they don't? What would convince you in a historical document that a miracle took place?
Well, in the historical documents, that they're saying the miracle took place, but that is the claim. That is the claim. I think the standard would... we've already talked about standards that would have to be used. When you used your kind of moon example, we'd have to investigate those standards. But, that's a different thing, because when you're talking about historical documents, you don't even have that kind of present thing. It's even harder to establish that it's a miracle, because all you've got is writing. This is why I'm trying to find out and dig down as to whether, to what exactly convinces you about the documents, the gospel accounts and the letters of Paul that actually make you think that it was actually a miracle, that the resurrection actually took place. Because these are the claims written in the book. And yet we have other books from other religions which make similar claims, and the general kind of criteria, the general yardstick, seems to carry throughout all of them.
So which other religious texts, and I might be lost here on this. So, like, Islam doesn't claim that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead.
No, it has equivalent claims, though.
Okay,
which follow the same criteria.
So what do you mean by equivalent claim? Are you saying that in the text
I mean supernatural claims. Okay,
so just in general, supernatural claims. That's fair. They do have those, but I'm saying, the if you're saying that other religions have a similar claim with regards to, like Islam doesn't say that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead, but you're saying
no, just supernatural claims in general, which we have.
I agree with you that you have to do a historical Hold on one second, about 15, 20. So I agree with you that you have to do that particular investigation with regards to miracle claims. Sure. So like one of them would be this. So let me give you an example of how I would differentiate the claims of miracles in the Bible, specifically the resurrection, to say another religion. So for instance, when you look at the claim that Muhammad rode on a winged horse, and I believe it's split the moon in half, right? Is that the correct one? Or rode on a winged horse? How many people, in the writing attest to seeing that? How many people are present for that moment? Well,
I don't think that's relevant, because that is part of the claim.
It is relevant, because what you don't have is you don't have a
look, we didn't have time to go into this, but to cut it really, really short, they're not eyewitnesses in the texts. What we have with the Gospels is people who are they're essentially newspaper reports. They're not saying that myself and Mary Magdalene witnessed this events. They're saying Mary Magdalene and these other people witnessed these events. They're not writing as witnesses. They're writing a report. Now, if you have a look at the Quran in Surah Al-Qamar 54, 1-2, which is where Muhammad splits the moon, that is the same thing. It's somebody writing about an event. It's writing about a claim.
Who's the writer of that? Who's the writer of that particular surah?
We don't know who the writer of that is, just like we don't know who the writer of the gospel accounts are.
Okay, that's a totally different debate that we can have for sure.
3 minutes left, gentlemen.
So here's the rub for me. Here's the rub for me on this particular issue, is that you're wanting to say on one hand, these writings back in the first century, they're newspaper reports, they don't count. There's not good evidence.
I'm not saying they don't count.
Okay, not saying they don't count's not good. That's
what I'm saying is if we've got to apply the same yardstick across all supernatural claims in different religions.
Right. And so here's the rub that I have on this is that on one hand you're saying here's this yardstick, and this yardstick happens across all religions. And then for this particular claim about 1 Corinthians 15, you're saying that's, and maybe I'm misunderstanding you, saying that's not good. That's not good evidence that something took place as a historical miracle in a historical document. But then on the other hand, when I ask you, okay, well, what is the standard by which you would accept a miracle claim in a historical document? You simply revert back to, well, we have to investigate it. But you haven't yet shown or haven't yet said, what is the criteria specifically by which Richard Gilliver would say, yeah, in that if a historical document had the following things, I would accept it as a miracle claim. You've simply said, well, it's just difficult because, well, that's history.
Well, I don't know how to investigate a miracle claim anyway without actually investigating, because we don't know what a miracle is. We don't know what a miracle actually taking place looks like, because if the examples you've given earlier on, we have methods to investigate them, which could show that they're not miracles.
Okay, so then this just comes back to some of the things that we've talked about before.
All right, then you have one follow-up, then we'll let Rich reply, and then we'll get into audience questions.
Yeah, well, it just comes back to the things before. You can't investigate the historical miracle claim because you're saying, well, we don't even have any evidence that, miracles take place or that miracles have happened. And so it's just, for me, the frustration is anytime we try and move down, whether it's miracles, whether it's non-natural events, whether it's historical, claims about miracles and what you would accept as miracles, it's simply, well, what you've got's not good enough, or what you've got doesn't count, or what you've got is a bad definition, or what you've got is not sufficient. But then there's nothing on the other end of that to say, and this is what I would accept as, a miracle claim. This is what I would accept as a non-natural event. This is what I would accept as a historical, miracle per the viewing of historical documents. And so as long as you have that, then you're just in this vortex of, not having a standard and therefore never being able to affirm what would convince you. And for me, that's hard to have a discussion about when on one hand you're saying what you're presenting doesn't meet the standard, but I don't have a standard. So
I've not heard anything from you during this entire conversation wherein you've actually given a standard by which a miracle would be accepted. You're throwing to me, you don't have a standard for a miracle, yet I don't actually know what your standard is for a miracle.
All right, Dean, I'll give you one
regarding evidence.
Then we'll go into audience questions.
Well, I'm just saying, not probably 10 minutes ago, I went down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things by which you could establish that it'd be more probable than not that a miracle took place. Now, if that's not a standard that Richard accepts, that's fine for Richard, but I have provided that. So there you go.
All right. Thank you. Good job, gentlemen. Thank you for keeping it friendly, of course. It's always much appreciated. Real quick, I want to thank my top tier patrons: City Plaza, Left, Right, Left, Ryan Hammond, Kenneth Leonard, Sky, Secular Rarity, Philip Leach, Richard Gilliver, _Atheism, Amit Matthew. Thank you for your patronage. All right. First question is going to be for Dean from Vern. If your definition of a miracle includes a supernatural component, then you have to prove a supernatural cause exists first. No?
I don't think so. My definition of miracle is an event that would not have happened if the natural world were left to itself. So that's simply, that may raise the probability that may provide evidence that may raise the probability that a supernatural being exists. But I don't have to reverse engineer it. I don't have to say, okay, well, because God exists, therefore miracles. I don't in necessity have to do that. You could have a completely different debate. You could go down all of the other traditional theistic claims and then say, or theistic, arguments for the existence of God, and then say, and therefore miracles are possible. You certainly could do that, but it's not necessary for this particular conversation.
All right. Another question for Dean. Can you ask Dean how he calculated or would calculate the probability he keeps invoking?
Right. So specifically with regards to probability, I would simply say, just in general, if you meet these particular criteria that I've set out about distant event, opinions, uncertain events, belated reports, trivial events, and self-serving events. If you were to look at those and you say, okay, how does this particular claim match up to these particular things? Then you could simply say, hey, they do match up. And so I'm not going to accept that as a miracle because of the distance of the event. Whereas if the distance of the event is relatively close to where that person lived, where that person was, even in modern day, you can say, okay, well, that raises the probability, the possibility that a miracle took place. Just in general, I'm not going to go once again. Not I could go and try and figure out some Bayes theorem if that would appease people, but just in general, that's how I would probably go about it.
All right.
Can I just respond to that really quickly as well?
Yeah, just keep it short.
Yeah, I just think that criteria that Dean uses evidences other religions. It certainly evidences the supernatural claims in Buddhism and in Islam.
Okay. Sure, but okay, I won't respond. But that's part of. Never mind. I'll get that to the in the closing, unless you're going to let me respond, Ethan.
If you can make it really quickly.
Real
sure.
quick, that's the only thing that I argued in the opening statement with regards to the original proposition.
Okay, question for Richard. This is a follow-up question from earlier. I don't want to appeal to expertise here. If he was given a miracle claim, how would he go about testing out the validity?
I can't really respond any other way than I already have. I would have a look to see if there was any other criteria, any other candidate explanation for it.
Okay.
I don't know how to respond other than that.
Okay. A question or from Meet Matthew. Thank you for the $10 super chat. Excellent debate, folks. Dean, flipping the script on you. Take the position of the non-believer. How would you establish that God is a candidate explanation for anything?
So can you put that back up so I can read it?
Sure.
So excellent. Okay, so take the position of a non-believer. How would you establish that God is a candidate explanation for anything? So I guess what they're saying is, if I'm an atheist, how would I go about establishing that God is a candidate to explain some type of event? Well, first I would look at, and I would say, as a non-believer, I would ask the question, all right, well, what does the uniformity of nature predict with regards to how the world works? All right, number one. And then two, I would ask, okay, does this particular event, does that fall in line with the uniformity of nature, or does this fall in line with something that is outside the purview of the uniformity of nature? And if it falls outside of the uniformity of nature, nature being left to itself, then what are my candidates for best explanation, right? So we've been talking about the resurrection. So resurrection question, uniformity of nature, people that die stay dead. This takes place outside of the purview of the uniformity of nature, that people stay dead. All right, here's one hypothesis. The hypothesis is the resurrection hypothesis. Okay, can this particular piece be explained by other naturalistic hypotheses or not? If it can't be, then the best explanation is the resurrection hypothesis, right? So that would be one thing, just in general, quick shot, how I would look at something like that. Then I would maybe consider, the existence of God. What is available to me to say that God is the candidate for the existence of the universe, or dare I say, the beginning of the universe. All right, what are those arguments? Do those arguments hold weight? What are the positive arguments for it? What are the positive or negative arguments against it? And weigh that as evidence and come to a conclusion.
All right. Hell's Bells, thank you for the $5 super chat. Great to see you doing what you love. Best YFNA. To my friend Richard and Dean, thanks for willing to engage with the godless heathens. All right, Dean, do you by chance have 5 extra minutes or no?
5 extra minutes? Yeah, I got 5 extra minutes.
Okay, because we just still got a few more questions. I'm going to try to get to all of them, but I don't know if we're going to be able to. One-Eyed Heathen asks, how do we tell the difference between a natural and not natural event?
Right. So one of the things that you could do is an example that I used earlier that Richard disagreed with based upon mere possibility is, and maybe I'll come up with another one. So, uniformity of nature, all things being equal, yet today is going to be the same as yesterday. If let me think here, if there's a crowd of people that were at on a safari in Zambia with cameras, and someone decided to say, yeah, I'm going to make this elephant levitate. I'm going to throw it 200 yards. And they said, all right. And they did that. For me, that would be a non-natural event because those are things that don't happen regularly. So
Okay. Lilypad, thank you for the $49.99 super chat. Thanks for a lively debate, gentlemen. Okay. I'm trying to find the next. Okay, here we go. Question from Best Name. Can Dean explain why we shouldn't take everything in the Bible literally? Regarding contradictions between chapters, which parts are true or more true and more important than others?
Wow, that's like 5 questions in one, but it's okay. I'll try and tackle it. So I would first need to know what the question, the person asking the question, what do they mean by literally? Because obviously I don't take the poetry sections like the Psalms where it says, and let the trees shout for joy and clap their hands. Like I don't take that literally. That's poetry. So I don't take the Bible literally in that sense. I take the Bible as it comes to me in the forms that it comes to me with particular genres that are presented. So like there's law, there's poetry, there's historical narrative, there's gospel, there's epistle, there's apocalyptic literature. So I don't like the phrase we should take the Bible literally, because I don't think you should take the Bible literally. I think you should take the Bible as it presents itself in the genres that are presented. I hope that makes sense. Can you put the question back up there one more time? So that's the first part. So regarding contradictions between chapters, which parts are true or more important than others? So I think with regards to chapters, I think we need to be open and honest about that. That's certainly a possibility. I look at contradictions as A and not A. And so the question becomes, if we have those contradictions, is that an actual contradiction? And does that contradiction in any way, shape, or form undercut, some of the core pieces of or core propositions of Christianity? So for instance, if the world isn't 6,000 years old, does that undercut Jesus raising from the dead? I don't think so. I think you can have, the world being billions of years old, and just in principle, the world being billions of years old and Jesus rising from the dead, that would still make Christianity true, in my opinion. Throw it back up there one more time. Which parts are true or more true and more important than others? Right. So I think this is a matter of not just exegesis, but hermeneutics. I think the more distant we get from a particular chapter in the Bible, the harder it's going to be to establish its historicity without appealing to the doctrine of inspiration and the doctrine of inerrancy. So for me, let's say you were to say something like, do you think that it's true that X event took place in Genesis or Exodus or Deuteronomy? Well, I think that number one, how far away are we from the event? What's the available evidence? And, could it have happened? Sure, it could have happened, but does the evidence support that this actually took place? That's something that we can then have conversation about with regards like which are more important than others. I think with regards to particularly the Bible, I don't think there's necessarily one particular section that's more important than the other because it's presented as a unified narrative. So that's my best shot. Nice question.
Thank you, Dean. Unfortunately, we are over time, so I'm not going to have
time. Longer if you want to.
Oh,
I can get 10 more in.
Okay. So let me go to Richard.
People have been patiently waiting. They deserve to have their answered.
That's very kind of you. All right. Question for Richard. Could you steelman Dan's assertion? What methodology would be sufficient to accept miracle claims in the Bible could be true? I didn't hear Dean clearly state a methodology.
To be honest, neither did I. I could try and steal Dean's methodology. It seemed to agree with me on the 4 points I made in general. And it seemed then it went into, which, if I can just pull that up again, just to remind myself, that there are no contemporary biblical accounts from any source attesting to the resurrection. We do have later Roman accounts that talk about it. Before the accounts were written down in the Gospels, they would have been passed on orally, and they are authentic representations of what people actually believed. He seemed to generally agree with that, which is, I've heard him speak on that many, many times, and that's the impression I got. That's why I wrote them down. And then he went into more specifics, which I can't remember the exact details of, but I don't have any particular problems with the specifics he went into. The difficulty I have with that is that it just seems to evidence other religious supernatural claims as well, which leaves us with a very, very big problem if the resurrection is supposed to be evidence that this Christian God actually exists.
All right. Question for Dean. How could you possibly demonstrate that someone from the past wasn't mistaken? How could you rule out all other explanations?
Right. So we demonstrate that people from the past are mistaken, by obviously historical investigation. So you can, and that's simply been the case, specifically with, things like where was Nero at the burning of of Rome? Well, some people say, hey, he was out of town. Some people say he was, I think they say he was back in the palace. Other people say he was, off somewhere playing a flute. So we demonstrate that they're mistaken by saying, okay, well, what are the number of people who wrote about that particular incident? What is the consensus about where Nero was when, Rome was burned? The other thing that people do is, what can counter somebody who's being mistaken is archaeological evidence. Someone could say, hey, this is what, and we do this all the time with, ancient Near East and Middle Eastern archaeology. They say, hey, here's the standard of, when this particular civilization was around. Here's the documentation about that civilization. We found new archaeological evidence that's shown that actually is wrong, and that shouldn't be granted or taken, for instance. And once again, it's not an exact science. It's, hey, based upon what we have, here's the most, the best possible answer. Sure, people in history were mistaken, but just because people in history were mistaken doesn't mean that with regards to these historical investigations that may be slanted in favor of a religious position, that we need to just assume, well, okay, or not assume, but be overly anxious to say, well, they could have been mistaken in light of the evidence. So there you go.
All right. So unfortunately, there's no way we're going to be able to get to the rest of the questions. I'm sorry to the audience. I just don't want to keep these people past their agreed upon time. And I'd like to give them time for closing statements. So Richard, starting with you, where could everyone check you out at? And do you have anything in closing to ask or say to Dean?
You can find me on the ACA, on the non-profits, and guesting on occasional call-in shows, which I'd like to do more often, because I miss the perspective, Ethan.
I miss the perspective too. It will come back, I promise.
Yeah, you can find me at the ACA. I also do a weekly podcast called Skeptic Hangout with Josh Entner from the Bloody Good Film podcast, and Laura McGee, who's also a fellow ACA host. and I'd occasionally do, because I don't have much time to do it, my own kind of skeptic takeout show, which is like deep diving. It's usually about 45-minute videos, so they're quite long and boring and academic, and they always try and stick academic sources in there as to kind of back up everything I say on there. I'm also on TikTok and Twitter. If you want to see me making short, informal videos, go to TikTok. If you want to see and look for Skeptic Skeptic Takeout. I'm getting confused. I've got that many skeptic shows. And on Twitter, you'll usually find me just arguing with really crap apologists.
Okay, cool. And did you have any last?
Oh yeah, I forgot that bit. Sorry. Yeah, I think I this show was entitled something along the lines of "Do supernatural events or do miracle
Are
claims?"
supernatural claims sufficient to demonstrate God's existence?
Yeah, and I think even in Dean's own kind of definition of a miracle, it kind of didn't even. He just said it's something that it's a non-natural event. And that doesn't even necessarily include God. So I don't see even it within his own definition how that can evidence God. It seems to be saying anything that's unexplained is unnatural. And the other thing is that I think Dean he agreed generally with the criteria for accepting miracle claims. And all the criteria he gave seems to evidence other religions, and I think that's a very, very important thing. Finally, I often tell Christians to read the Bible, because a lot of Christians don't. Dean's not one of those, thankfully. And in Dean's defense, and in Christians in general, I often hear kind of skeptics and atheists come out and say, Christians don't know the Bible, or Christians don't read the Bible properly. I study religion academically. I know Dean studies religion academically. And there are lots of different ways to read your Bible, which are all legitimate. If you're reading your Bible as a religious believer and looking into the theology of that, that's a legitimate way to read it. And it might not necessarily agree with all the things you disagree with as an atheist, but it's still legitimate. So as a skeptic, we should, I think it's our place first and foremost to say to ourselves, we should do better. We should be doing that if we're going to be coming in and having debates with apologists. We should hold ourselves to the standard we want to hold them to as well. And I think we can all do better.
Awesome. Thank you. I was just about to put Dean on, but he turned off his camera, so we'll have to wait a second.
Sorry, my cat was about to take down one of my lights. I had to, just more evidence for hell. Cats all day.
I love cats.
So, sorry.
Real quick last minute super chat from Callie Laughlin, $5. Thanks for the debate. Still not sure what non-natural means. All right, Dean, where can everyone check you out at, and what would you like to say in closing?
Right. Yeah. So you can check me out at the Daily Apologist YouTube channel. TheDailyApologist.com is where we are, or my own personal channel is just Dean Meadows. Also on Instagram, Facebook, all that stuff. And so first, I want to thank you, Ethan, for hosting this. It's been a quick minute since you've hosted one of these. I'm glad that we're one of the it's been a while. I'm glad we're one of the first ones. Hopefully this is a continuing trend of yours. Also, really want to thank Richard. It's like, what time is it there?
It's 2:15 in the morning.
So I give him all the props for burning the candle at both ends here. And I'd also like to tell Richard, I appreciate the passionate disagreement that we have about this particular issue. And it's been a pleasure having this conversation with you. And I would love to do this at some point on a campus, either there, here, and have Ethan be the moderator. I think a live Your Friendly Neighborhood Atheist at some point would be great.
I've been wanting to get into lives like that. So,
right.
Yeah.
So maybe since I'm a campus minister here at Virginia Tech, I might be able to set something like that up. And if Richard is interested, I would love to do that. So as I look at this debate or this discussion tonight, the question, that's in the foreground of the channel is, are miracles evidence for the existence of God? And so I laid out, my definitions, and I also laid out, what Richard had to do tonight. That Richard had to show how a miracle, since the question presupposes a miracle, had to show how a miracle doesn't raise the probability of the existence of God. One, I don't think that he did that. And so the other interesting thing as I look back and think back at the debate, one thing that kept coming up is that Richard kept saying when questioned, either I don't know or I don't have a standard. And that was one thing, so that at least makes his position agnostic with regards to the OP. But the other thing is, it's hard for Richard to come into the debate and say, what you have does not meet the standard of a miracle. What you have, it does not meet the standard of something that is non-natural. And what you have is not the standard for X. But at the same time, I either don't know or don't have a standard. And so it would have been nice for Richard to have a standard. Furthermore, the vast majority of things that we talked about with regards to the debate topic, what we actually talked about for the second half of the debate was not within the purview, in my opinion, in the purview of the actual debate topic. While it was fruitful and I liked it, it wasn't the debate topic. So he didn't give, he said, we don't know that these things even make God a candidate for miracles. And then he listed things like aliens or whatnot, but he never gave any evidence for why those are more probable than God. He just appealed to, he didn't, I guess what I'm saying is he didn't justify why aliens would be more of a candidate thoroughly than God. He also kept saying, throughout the debate that these particular things, undercut the Christian God, or they have all the religions in there, or this doesn't fit with the Christian God definition. Well, I never claimed in my opening that I was debating for the Christian God. I clearly said in my opening that I was arguing for general theism. And so as I look back at the debate, I want the audience to realize that Richard, in my opinion, simply asked some very good questions, but at the end of the day, he simply showed the fruits of the naturalistic worldview. And then the last thing I would say is that I never made the claim within the debate that the unexplained equals God. And so for those reasons, I think the audience should take into serious consideration that Richard didn't meet the standard of the OP, and seriously consider that God does exist on the basis of the existence of miracles.
Thank you, Dean. Richard, you look like you're chomping at the bit a little bit.
Yeah, I think there were quite a bit of misrepresentation going off in that closing, but we can leave that there.
Well, Dean did start the discussion, so I can give you 1 minute to reply, and then we got to go.
Yeah, I mean, it said several times in that I didn't have a standard, and several times throughout the kind of conversation, I'd tell him I did have a standard, and I explained what that standard was. That was the evidence we can test. And also, he said that, I forget his exact wordings, about something along the lines of aliens without giving any kind of reasoning behind that. And yeah, I did give reasoning behind that. I said that, we know.
I said thorough justification.
Sorry, repeat that.
Anyways, no, just go ahead. We got to roll. I got to roll. Don't worry about it.
No, I just think, I suggested that, we know life forms on planets. We know there are other planets out there. And we know that life that forms can make technology. I think they're all pretty good reasons or pretty good justifications for accepting that that's possible. I'm done. Sorry.
I keep leaving myself muted. Crap. Thank you both for a friendly and
That's what we call a Johnny P. Angel on the non-profits.
and taking the time out of your guys' busy schedule to do this debate. It's much appreciated. If you want to see more from either of them, check out the channels or the shows they're on. Yes, I will be bringing the perspective back at some point. I would like to host more debates like these, but the issue is finding the right people, because I always want the debates to remain friendly. Like, I don't like name calling or yelling or aggression. Like, that's not something I want as a representation of my channel. So if you have any good debaters you can suggest, let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe, all the good stuff. And Dean, Richard, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks both.